The rain fell in sheets across the cobblestone streets of Prague, each droplet catching the amber glow of gas lamps that lined the narrow alleys of the old quarter. It was the kind of rain that seemed to wash away the boundary between centuries, making the medieval architecture feel as immediate and alive as the modern world pressing in from beyond the castle walls. In a third-floor apartment overlooking the Vltava River, a woman named Elena Kovač sat by her window, watching the storm transform the city into something from a forgotten dream. Elena had lived in Prague for 3 years, having moved from her native Serbia to pursue her doctorate in medieval history at Charles University. Her research focused on the folklore of Eastern Europe, particularly the vampire legends that had persisted across generations, despite the rational enlightenment of modernity. She found it endlessly fascinating how stories of the undead had evolved, how they reflected the fears and anxieties of different eras, how they refused to die even as the world around them transformed beyond recognition. The apartment was small but comfortable, filled with books stacked on every available surface. Her desk sat beneath the window, covered in photocopies of ancient manuscripts, handwritten notes in 3 languages, and her laptop displaying a half-finished chapter of her dissertation. She had been working on the same paragraph for hours, trying to articulate something about the persistence of vampire mythology in communities that had experienced significant trauma, but the words kept escaping her. The rain seemed to be calling her attention away from the screen, pulling her thoughts toward the darkness gathering beyond the glass. Lightning flickered across the sky, momentarily illuminating the Charles Bridge in the distance. Elena could see the silhouettes of the Baroque statues that lined the bridge, 30 figures frozen in eternal gestures of blessing and warning. She had walked across that bridge countless times, always feeling a strange connection to those stone saints and martyrs. They had witnessed centuries of human passage, watching as empires rose and fell, as wars ravaged the land and peace returned, as generations lived and died beneath their unchanging gaze. The thunder that followed the lightning was deep and resonant, seeming to shake the very foundations of the building. Elena shivered despite the warmth of her apartment. She had always loved storms, found them invigorating and cleansing, but tonight there was something different in the air. She could feel it in her bones, a tension that went beyond the atmospheric pressure, a sense that something was about to shift in ways she could not yet comprehend. She turned back to her laptop, forcing herself to focus on the work at hand. Her dissertation argued that vampire folklore served as a cultural mechanism for processing collective trauma, allowing communities to externalize their fears and grief into tangible, if supernatural, form. The vampire became a vessel for all that was unresolved, all that haunted the living because it had been denied proper burial or acknowledgement. In this sense, the vampire was not merely a monster but a symptom, a manifestation of wounds that refused to heal. The theory was sound, supported by extensive research into historical accounts and contemporary folklore studies. Yet as Elena wrote, she found herself wondering if there was something more to these stories, something that transcended academic analysis. She had spent so much time studying the vampire as metaphor that she had perhaps lost sight of why these legends had such power in the first place. They spoke to something primal in the human psyche, something that rational thought could not fully encompass. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her concentration. It was a message from her advisor, Professor Novak, asking if she could meet him the following evening at the National Library. He had apparently come across some manuscripts that might be relevant to her research, documents that had recently been transferred from a private collection. Elena replied that she would be there, grateful for any new material that might help her break through the creative block she had been experiencing. She stood and walked to the small kitchen to make tea, her mind already wandering to what these manuscripts might contain. The National Library housed an extensive collection of medieval texts, many of which had never been fully cataloged or studied. It was possible that Professor Novak had found something genuinely significant, some first-hand account of vampire beliefs that could add depth to her analysis. As the water boiled, Elena found herself thinking about her grandmother, who had died when Elena was 16. Her grandmother had grown up in a small village in rural Serbia, a place where the old beliefs still held sway despite the encroachment of modernity. She had told Elena stories about the creatures that haunted the darkness, about the Strigoyan vampire that preyed upon the living. These were not the glamorous vampires of popular fiction, but something far more visceral and terrifying. Corpses animated by malevolent spirits, bloated and grotesque, spreading disease and death wherever they went. Elena had listened to these stories with fascination and skepticism, recognizing them as folklore even as a child. Yet her grandmother had spoken with such conviction, such certainty, that Elena had sometimes wondered if the old woman truly believed in what she was saying. Perhaps belief was too strong a word. Perhaps it was more accurate to say that her grandmother lived in a world where such things were possible, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was more permeable than modern rationality allowed. The kettle whistled, pulling Elena back to the present. She poured the hot water over a tea bag, watching as the liquid darkened to a deep amber. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and she found herself drawn back to her spot by the glass, cradling the warm mug in her hands. The city below was a study in contrasts. Medieval spires rising alongside modern buildings, gas lamps glowing near neon signs, the ancient and contemporary existing in uneasy harmony. Prague had always felt like a city caught between worlds, a place where time moved differently. Perhaps that was why she had been drawn here, why she felt more at home in these narrow streets than she ever had in the sterile suburbs where she had grown up. Elena sipped her tea and let her mind wander. She thought about the nature of immortality, about what it would mean to exist outside the normal flow of time. The vampire, in most traditions, was cursed with eternal life, doomed to witness the passage of ages while remaining forever unchanged. It was a fascinating inversion of the usual human desire for immortality. In vampire lore, eternal life was not a blessing but a punishment, a state of perpetual exile from the natural order. This seemed to Elena to be one of the most psychologically astute aspects of vampire mythology. Humans feared death, certainly, but they also feared being left behind, being forgotten, existing in a state of permanent alienation from the living world. The vampire embodied both the desire for immortality and the horror of achieving it, representing the dark side of the human wish to transcend mortality. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in its brief illumination, Elena thought she saw a figure standing on the bridge. It was just a silhouette, barely visible through the rain, but something about its stillness caught her attention. While everything else moved with the wind and water, this figure seemed perfectly motionless, as if rooted to the stone beneath its feet. Thunder followed immediately, loud enough to make Elena jump. When she looked back at the bridge, the figure was gone. She told herself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the statues, but she could not shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching. She finished her tea and decided to call it a night. Her eyes were tired from staring at the computer screen, and her mind was too restless to focus on academic writing. She would get a fresh start in the morning, perhaps take a walk through the old town before meeting with Professor Novak in the evening. Elena prepared for bed, going through the familiar rituals of washing her face and brushing her teeth. She changed into her pajamas and climbed under the covers, listening to the rain continue its rhythmic percussion against the windows. Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept returning to the figure on the bridge, to the strange tension she had felt in the air all evening. Finally, sometime after midnight, she drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her dreams were vivid and disjointed, filled with images of dark corridors and whispering voices. She found herself walking through a vast library, its shelves stretching endlessly in all directions. The books were bound in leather so old it seemed to crumble at her touch, and when she opened them, the pages were filled with text in a language she could not read. In the dream, she knew she was searching for something, though she could not remember what. She moved through the library with increasing urgency, pulling books from shelves and letting them fall to the floor when they proved useless. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her from all sides, and she realized with growing dread that she was not alone among the stacks. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead of her, tall and dressed in clothes from another century. She could not see the face, but she felt the weight of its gaze upon her. The figure raised one hand, pointing toward a particular shelf, and Elena found herself drawn toward it despite her fear. She reached for the book the figure indicated, a massive tome bound in black leather with no title on its spine. As her fingers touched the cover, she woke with a start, her heart racing and her skin covered in cold sweat. The room was dark except for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a profound silence that seemed almost oppressive after the storm's fury. Elena lay in bed, trying to calm her breathing and make sense of the dream. It had felt so real, so immediate, that she could still smell the musty scent of old paper and feel the weight of that black book in her hands. She told herself it was just her subconscious processing her research, her mind creating narrative from the fragments of folklore and history she studied every day. Yet as she lay there in the darkness, she could not shake the feeling that the dream had been something more than random neural firings. It had felt like a message, like a warning, though she could not say what it was warning her about. She eventually fell back into a dreamless sleep, and when she woke again, it was morning. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, and she could hear the sounds of the city coming to life below her window. The unease of the night before seemed distant now, almost foolish in the clear light of day. Elena got up and made coffee, then sat at her desk to review the work she had done the previous evening. Reading it with fresh eyes, she was pleased to find that it was better than she had thought. The argument was sound, the prose clear, and she needed only minor revisions before moving on to the next section. She spent the morning writing, making good progress on her dissertation. By early afternoon, she had completed a full chapter and felt satisfied enough to take a break. She decided to go for a walk, to clear her head and stretch her legs after so many hours at the desk. The city was beautiful in the aftermath of the storm. The air was crisp and clean, and the cobblestones gleamed with residual moisture. Elena walked without a particular destination in mind, letting her feet carry her through the winding streets of the old town. She passed cafes where people sat outside despite the cool temperature, soaking up what little sunshine broke through the clouds. She passed shops selling everything from antique books to modern electronics, the old and new existing side by side in perfect Prague fashion. Eventually, she found herself approaching the Charles Bridge. She had not consciously decided to come here, but she was not surprised. The bridge had been in her thoughts since the previous night, since she had seen that mysterious figure standing motionless in the rain. The bridge was crowded with tourists and street vendors, artists selling paintings and musicians playing for spare change. The Baroque statues looked down on the human traffic with their eternal expressions of piety and suffering. Elena walked slowly, examining each statue as she passed, reading the plaques that identified the various saints and martyrs they represented. She was about halfway across when she stopped at the statue of Saint John of Nepomuk, the patron saint of Bohemia. According to legend, John had been thrown from this very bridge in the 14th century for refusing to reveal the secrets of the Queen's confession to King Wenceslaus. The statue showed him surrounded by angels, and at its base was a bronze relief that countless tourists had touched over the centuries, rubbing it for good luck until it shone brighter than the surrounding metal. Elena reached out and touched the relief, feeling the smoothness of the worn bronze beneath her fingers. She did not believe in luck. Not really, but there was something comforting about participating in a tradition that had been practiced for hundreds of years. It connected her to all those who had stood in this exact spot before her, to the continuous chain of human presence that stretched back through time. As she stood there, lost in thought, she became aware of someone watching her. It was not the casual observation of a passing tourist, but something more focused, more intent. She turned slowly, scanning the crowd for the source of her unease. He was standing near the edge of the bridge, leaning against the stone railing as if he had all the time in the world. He was tall and slim, dressed in a long black coat that seemed out of place among the casual clothing of the other pedestrians. His hair was dark and fell just past his shoulders, and even from a distance, Elena could see that his features were striking, almost beautiful in their symmetry. What caught her attention most, however, were his eyes. Even across the space that separated them, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He was looking directly at her, not with the furtive glances of someone who has been caught staring, but with open, unabashed interest. Elena felt a flush of discomfort. She was not unused to being noticed by men, but there was something different about this. The man's attention felt too knowing, as if he could see past the surface of her appearance to something deeper and more essential. She turned away, deciding to continue across the bridge and leave the strange encounter behind. But when she glanced back a moment later, the man was gone. She scanned the crowd, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had simply vanished into the throng of tourists, though Elena could not imagine how he could have moved so quickly without her noticing. Unsettled, she quickened her pace, wanting to put the bridge behind her. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that the man had simply been another tourist admiring the statues, that his disappearance was easily explained by the crowd and her own distraction. Yet she could not shake the feeling that their brief exchange of looks had meant something, had marked her in some way she did not yet understand. She spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the city, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythms of Prague street life. She stopped at a cafe for lunch, then browsed in a bookshop specializing in occult and esoteric texts. The shop was dimly lit and smelled of old paper and incense, and the proprietor, an elderly man with thick glasses, barely acknowledged her presence. Elena found herself drawn to a section on vampire folklore, amused by the synchronicity. The books ranged from serious academic studies to sensationalized accounts of supposed true vampire encounters. She picked up a volume titled Vampires of Bohemia, Historical Accounts and Folk Beliefs, and flipped through it, finding detailed descriptions of supposed vampire incidents in the Czech lands during the 18th century. One account particularly caught her attention. It described an outbreak of vampire hysteria in a village south of Prague in 1732. Several villagers had died under mysterious circumstances, and the community had become convinced that a recently deceased man named Petr Blazinin had returned from the grave to prey upon the living. The villagers had exhumed his body and found it, according to the account, uncorrupted and bloated with fresh blood. They had driven a stake through the corpse's heart and burned it to ashes. What made the account interesting was not the supernatural elements, which Elena recognized as typical of vampire folklore, but the historical context. The author noted that the village had recently been devastated by plague, and the vampire hysteria had emerged in the aftermath of this trauma. It was a perfect example of Elena's thesis about folklore serving as a mechanism for processing collective suffering. She bought the book, along with a slim volume of Czech vampire legends translated into English, and left the shop as evening began to fall. She made her way toward the National Library, where she was scheduled to meet Professor Novak. The National Library was housed in the Clementinum, a vast Baroque complex that had once been a Jesuit college. The building was a labyrinth of corridors and halls, libraries and chapels, its architecture a testament to the grandeur and ambition of the Counter-Reformation. Elena had spent countless hours here during her research, but she never tired of the building's beauty and atmosphere. Professor Novak was waiting for her in the reading room, a space with high ceilings and walls lined with ancient books. He was a small, energetic man in his 60s, with wild gray hair and an infectious enthusiasm for his subject. He greeted Elena warmly and led her to a desk where several manuscripts lay carefully arranged on foam supports. The professor explained that these documents had been part of a private collection belonging to a noble family that had died out in the early 20th century. The collection had been stored in various locations over the decades, and only recently had it been properly cataloged and made available to researchers. Among the papers were several texts that dealt with supernatural beliefs and practices in medieval Bohemia. One manuscript in particular had caught Professor Novak's attention. It was a journal kept by a Franciscan monk named Brother Andreas in the late 15th century. The monk had served as a kind of ecclesiastical investigator, traveling from village to village to address reports of demonic activity, possession, and other supernatural phenomena. Elena carefully opened the manuscript, handling the fragile pages with practiced care. The text was in Latin, written in a neat but faded hand. She began to read, translating as she went, while Professor Novak watched with barely contained excitement. Brother Andreas wrote with a curious mixture of piety and pragmatism. He described his investigations methodically, noting the symptoms reported by villagers, the physical evidence he examined, and the conclusions he reached. In most cases, he attributed the supposed supernatural events to natural causes or human deception. Demonic possession was often illness or madness, haunting was the product of overactive imagination, and miraculous appearances could usually be explained by suggestion and fraud. But there were a handful of cases where Brother Andreas admitted to being at a loss for explanation. These were marked in the margin with a small cross, and the monk's usually confident tone became tentative and uncertain. One such case involved a village in what is now southern Bohemia. Several children had died over the course of a few weeks, and the villagers believed they were being attacked by a vampire, a local term for a revenant or undead creature. Brother Andreas had arrived expecting to find the usual combination of disease and superstition, but what he discovered troubled him deeply. The monk described examining the bodies of the dead children and finding marks on their necks that he could not explain. They were not the bites of any animal he knew, nor did they resemble wounds made by human teeth. The children had died with expressions of terror on their faces, and several villagers reported seeing a pale figure lurking near the cemetery at night. Brother Andreas had ordered the exhumation of a recently deceased man who was suspected of being the vampire. The body, according to the monk's account, showed no signs of decomposition despite having been buried for nearly a month. The skin was pale but not discolored, and when the villagers drove a stake through the corpse's heart, fresh blood had flowed from the wound. The manuscript continued with Brother Andreas's attempts to rationalize what he had witnessed. He considered the possibility of premature burial, of unusual preservation due to soil conditions, of collective delusion affecting his own perceptions. But his writing betrayed a deep uncertainty, a sense that he had encountered something that challenged his understanding of the natural world. Elena read through the account twice, taking careful notes. It was exactly the kind of primary source material that could strengthen her dissertation. The fact that the investigator was an educated cleric rather than a superstitious peasant gave the account particular weight, demonstrating how even those trained in rational theology could be affected by vampire beliefs when confronted with unexplained phenomena. Professor Novak was delighted by her interest in the manuscript. He told her that she was welcome to spend as much time with it as she needed, and he could arrange for high-quality scans to be made if she wanted her own copies. They talked for over an hour about the implications of the text, about how it fit into the broader context of late medieval religious thought and folklore. By the time Elena left the library, night had fully fallen. The streets were less crowded now, and she found herself walking through pools of lamplight, separated by long stretches of shadow. The temperature had dropped, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself, wishing she had brought a scarf. She was thinking about Brother Andreas and his troubled encounter with the supposed vampire, wondering what he would have made of modern attempts to explain away his experiences through the lens of folklore and psychology. Would he have been relieved to have his doubts validated, or would he have insisted that his account was accurate, that he had truly witnessed something supernatural? Lost in thought, she did not notice the figure step out of a doorway ahead of her until she nearly collided with him. She gasped and stumbled back, her heart suddenly racing. It was the man from the bridge. He stood before her with that same intense gaze, and up close she could see that his features were even more striking than she had realized. His skin was pale, almost luminous in the lamplight, and his eyes were a shade of gray so light they appeared almost silver. There was something timeless about his face, as if he could have been 25 or 45, as if age had no meaning for him. Elena knew she should be frightened. A strange man had essentially ambushed her on a dark street, and every instinct of urban self-preservation told her to run. Yet she found herself frozen in place, held by his gaze like a bird before a serpent. The man spoke, and his voice was soft and cultured, with an accent she could not quite place. He asked if she was Elena Kovač, and the fact that he knew her name sent a spike of genuine fear through her paralysis. She managed to ask how he knew who she was, her voice coming out smaller and more frightened than she would have liked. The man smiled, and there was something sad in the expression, as if he regretted having to frighten her. He explained that he had been following her research with great interest, that he had read some of her published papers on vampire folklore, and that he believed they had much to discuss. He introduced himself as Viktor Černý, and he said that he had information that could be invaluable to her dissertation, if she was willing to hear it. Elena's fear began to mix with curiosity. The man's approach was certainly unorthodox, bordering on stalking, but something in his manner suggested genuine scholarly interest rather than malicious intent. She asked him how he had known she would be at the library tonight, and Viktor's smile widened slightly. He told her that he had his sources, that the academic community in Prague was smaller and more interconnected than she might think, and that news of interesting manuscript discoveries traveled quickly among those who paid attention. He asked if she would be willing to meet with him the following evening, somewhere public if that would make her more comfortable, so that he could share what he knew. Every rational part of Elena's mind screamed at her to refuse, to walk away from this strange encounter and report it to the police if necessary. Yet she found herself agreeing, suggesting a cafe near the university where she often worked. Viktor nodded, looking pleased, and told her he would see her there at 8 o'clock. Before she could say anything else, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows with remarkable speed. Elena stood alone on the street, wondering what had just happened, whether she had made a terrible mistake. She walked home quickly, checking over her shoulder several times to make sure she was not being followed. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door behind her and stood in the small entryway, trying to calm her racing heart. Part of her wanted to call Professor Novak to tell him about the encounter and ask his advice. But what would she say? That a man had approached her on the street claiming to have information about her research? That his eyes had been unusually pale and his manner somewhat intimidating? It sounded ridiculous when she put it in those terms, the product of an overactive imagination fed by too much time studying vampire folklore. Yet she could not deny that something about Viktor Černý had unsettled her on a deep, instinctive level. It was not just his knowledge of her identity or his sudden appearance from the shadows. It was something in his eyes, in the way he looked at her, as if he could see through all her defenses to the vulnerable person beneath. Elena made herself tea and tried to work on her dissertation, but she could not concentrate. Her mind kept returning to the encounter, analyzing every word that had been spoken, every nuance of Viktor's expression and tone. She found herself wondering what information he claimed to possess. What could be so important that he would track her down in this theatrical manner? Finally, she gave up on work and went to bed, though sleep was long in coming. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were troubled once more. She found herself back in the vast library from her previous dream, but this time she was not alone. Viktor was there, moving through the stacks with purposeful strides, pulling books from shelves and laying them open before her. In the dream, she could read the texts now, though the language was none she recognized in waking life. The books told stories of beings that lived in the spaces between mortal and immortal, creatures that had transcended death, but were forever denied the peace of the grave. They spoke of transformation and curse, of power purchased at terrible cost, of eternal hunger that could never be satisfied. Viktor's voice echoed through the library, though she could not see him anymore. He told her that truth was often hidden in plain sight, disguised as myth and legend, that the stories people dismissed as folklore were sometimes memories of genuine encounters with the impossible. Elena woke before dawn, her head aching and her thoughts confused. She lay in bed watching the darkness gradually give way to morning light, wondering what the coming evening would bring. Part of her was tempted to simply not show up at the cafe, to avoid Viktor and whatever strange agenda he was pursuing. But a larger part, the part of her that had devoted her life to seeking truth and understanding, was desperately curious about what he had to say. She went through her day in a distracted state, attending a seminar she barely paid attention to, meeting with her study group, but contributing little to the discussion. Her friends noticed her preoccupation and asked if she was feeling well, and she made excuses about being tired and stressed about her dissertation. As 8 o'clock approached, Elena found herself walking toward the cafe with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. She arrived a few minutes early and chose a table near the window where she could watch the street. She ordered coffee and waited, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. Viktor arrived precisely at 8, entering the cafe with the same fluid grace she had noticed the night before. He was dressed more casually tonight, in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, but he still carried himself with an aristocratic bearing that set him apart from the other patrons. He sat across from her and ordered tea when the waiter came by. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Elena was again struck by the unusual color of his eyes, that pale gray that seemed to catch and reflect the cafe's warm lighting. Viktor began by apologizing for frightening her the previous night. He acknowledged that his approach had been unorthodox, and that he should have found a more conventional way to make contact. He explained that he was something of a recluse, that he did not often engage with the academic world directly, and that social niceties sometimes escaped him. Elena asked him what his connection to academia was, whether he was affiliated with a university or research institution. Viktor smiled and said that his education had been informal but extensive, that he had been studying certain subjects for longer than she might imagine, and that his interest in vampire folklore was both scholarly and personal. This last phrase caught Elena's attention. She asked him what he meant by personal, and Viktor's expression became more serious. He told her that he had family connections to some of the historical incidents she was studying, that his ancestors had been involved in vampire hunts and exorcisms in the Czech lands during the 18th century. He reached into his bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal, old but well-preserved. He explained that this had belonged to his great-great-great-grandfather, a man named Viktor Černý, who had served as a kind of vampire hunter for several villages in southern Bohemia. The journal documented Václav's investigations and the methods he had used to identify and destroy supposed revenants. Elena's eyes widened with interest. Primary source documents from vampire hunters were extremely rare, and if this journal was authentic, it could be an invaluable addition to her research. She asked if she could examine it, and Viktor slid the journal across the table toward her. The leather was soft with age, and when Elena opened the journal, she could smell the faint mustiness of old paper. The text was in Czech, written in a cramped, hurried hand that suggested urgent record-keeping rather than leisurely memoir. She began to read, and what she found sent shivers down her spine. Viktor Černý had approached his work with a methodical thoroughness that reminded Elena of Brother Andreas. He documented symptoms, interviewed witnesses, examined corpses, and applied what he believed were scientific principles to determine whether the deceased had become vampiric. But unlike Brother Andreas, Viktor seemed to have no doubt about the reality of vampires. His journal was filled with detailed descriptions of exhumations, stakings, and burnings, carried out with absolute conviction. What made the journal particularly disturbing was the violence it described. Viktor did not simply stake suspected vampires through the heart. He decapitated them, stuffed their mouths with garlic and communion wafers, burned their remains, and scattered the ashes. The level of brutality suggested a deep-seated terror, a fear that went beyond rational concern about disease or social disorder. Elena read through several entries, taking mental notes of passages she wanted to study more carefully later. She asked Viktor if he would be willing to let her photograph the pages or have the journal scanned, and he said that he had actually brought it to give to her. He believed that the journal would be of more use to her research than it had ever been to him, gathering dust in his personal library. Elena was stunned by the generosity of the offer. Original documents like this were priceless for historical research, and Viktor was essentially giving her a gift that could transform her dissertation. She asked him if he was certain if there were no conditions or expectations attached to the donation. Viktor said that he had only one request. He wanted to meet with her regularly as she worked through the journal, to discuss what she found and to share his own knowledge of the family history and the context of the hunts. He was not asking for co-authorship or formal acknowledgement, merely the opportunity to engage with someone who could appreciate the significance of the material. Elena agreed, seeing no harm in the arrangement and considerable benefit. They talked for another hour about the journal and about vampire folklore more broadly. Elena was impressed by the depth of Viktor's knowledge. He seemed to know obscure details about regional variations in vampire beliefs, about the relationship between folklore and historical events, about the psychological and social factors that had contributed to vampire panics. There was something almost uncanny about his command of the subject. He spoke about events from the 18th century with a specificity and immediacy that went beyond normal historical knowledge. When Elena remarked on this, Viktor smiled and said that he had been studying these matters for a very long time, that they had become something of an obsession for him. As the evening wore on, Elena found herself relaxing in Viktor's presence. His initial appearance in the shadows had been unsettling, but in the warm light of the cafe, he seemed less threatening and more intriguing. There was an old-fashioned courtesy in his manner, a formality that reminded her of characters from 19th century novels. He listened intently when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her ideas and interpretations. When they finally parted, well after midnight, Elena walked home with Vaclav's journal carefully tucked in her bag. She felt energized in a way she had not in months, excited about her research in a manner that went beyond academic obligation. She had the sense that she was on the verge of something significant, though she could not have said exactly what. Over the following weeks, Elena and Viktor fell into a pattern. They would meet 2 or 3 times a week, always at night, always at cafes or restaurants in the old town. Viktor never suggested meeting during the day, and Elena noticed that he seemed to prefer dimly lit establishments, places where the shadows were deep and the lighting indirect. Elena spent her days working through Vaclav's journal, translating passages and cross-referencing them with other historical documents. The journal painted a vivid picture of life in rural Bohemia during a time of great uncertainty and fear. The villages Vaclav served were poor and isolated, ravaged by disease and harsh weather, and vampire beliefs seemed to offer an explanation for suffering that otherwise seemed random and meaningless. What struck Elena most forcefully was the ritualized nature of the vampire hunts. Vaclav followed precise procedures for identifying and destroying suspected revenants, procedures that seemed designed as much to comfort the living as to protect them from supernatural threats. The exhumation and mutilation of corpses was performed with community participation, transforming private grief into public spectacle and allowing the villagers to actively confront their fears. In their evening meetings, Viktor provided context and clarification for passages Elena found confusing. He seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of local history and customs, and he could explain references to people and places that Elena could not find in any published source. She began to wonder about his background, about where he had acquired such specialized knowledge. When she asked him directly about his education and research methods, Viktor was vague. He said that he was largely self-taught, that he had spent decades collecting documents and oral histories, that his family's connections to vampire hunting had led him down paths most scholars never explored. He did not seem to have formal credentials, and as far as Elena could determine, he had never published academic work. Yet there was no denying the value of his knowledge. With his help, Elena's understanding of vampire folklore deepened considerably. She began to see patterns she had missed before, connections between seemingly unrelated beliefs and practices. Viktor had a gift for synthesis, for drawing together disparate threads into coherent narratives. As Elena spent more time with Viktor, she found herself increasingly drawn to him in ways that went beyond intellectual collaboration. There was something magnetic about his presence, a quality she could not quite name but could definitely feel. When they talked, she felt as if she had his complete attention, as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. It was intoxicating and slightly dangerous, this sense of being truly seen and valued. She tried to maintain professional boundaries, to remind herself that this was a research partnership and nothing more. But she could not deny the flutter in her chest when she saw him waiting for her at their meeting places, could not ignore the way her pulse quickened when his hand accidentally brushed hers across a table. Viktor, for his part, remained scrupulously courteous. If he felt any attraction toward Elena, he gave no obvious sign. He was attentive and kind, but he maintained a certain distance, an invisible barrier that he never seemed to cross. This only made Elena more curious about him, more eager to understand the person behind the cultivated exterior. One evening, about a month into their acquaintance, they were discussing a particularly gruesome account of a vampire execution from Vaclav's journal. The vampire in question had allegedly killed 6 children before being discovered and destroyed. Vaclav described the exhumation in detail, noting that the corpse's eyes had been open and its mouth filled with fresh blood. Elena remarked that the account seemed designed to elicit maximum horror, that the lurid details served a narrative purpose beyond simple documentation. Viktor agreed, but added that sometimes the most horrific accounts were the most accurate, that people tended to sanitize their memories of traumatic events, to make them more palatable and less disturbing than the actual experience had been. There was something in his tone, a weight of personal knowledge, that made Elena look at him more closely. She asked if he had ever witnessed something traumatic, something that had shaped his interest in these dark subjects. Viktor was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant and unfocused. Finally, he told her that he had lost someone very close to him under circumstances that had never been adequately explained. He did not elaborate, and Elena sensed that this was as much as he was willing to share. She did not press him further, respecting his obvious pain and reluctance. But the brief glimpse into Viktor's emotional life made him seem more human to Elena, less like the mysterious figure who had emerged from the shadows, and more like someone carrying a burden of grief. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to offer some solace for whatever loss he had experienced. They walked together after leaving the cafe that night, wandering through the quiet streets of the old town. It was late, past 2 in the morning, and they encountered few other pedestrians. Viktor seemed pensive, lost in thoughts he did not share, and Elena walked beside him in companionable silence. They ended up at the Charles Bridge, standing at the same spot where Elena had first seen Viktor watching her. The river flowed dark and quiet beneath them, and the Baroque statues stood like sentinels in the night. Elena looked up at the statue of St. John of Nepomuk and remembered touching the bronze relief for luck, remembered the feeling of connection to all those who had stood in this same spot across the centuries. Viktor followed her gaze and remarked that the bridge had seen countless lives pass across it, countless stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy. He said that if stones could speak, they would tell tales that would break the heart and restore faith, often simultaneously. There was a melancholy in his voice that Elena had not heard before. She asked him if he believed in the supernatural, in ghosts and spirits and creatures that defied natural law. It was a question she had been wanting to ask for weeks, but had held back, fearing it would seem unprofessional or naive. Viktor turned to look at her, his pale eyes catching the lamplight. He said that he believed the universe was far stranger and more complex than human reason could fully comprehend, that there were phenomena that science had not yet explained and might never explain, that the boundary between the natural and supernatural was perhaps more permeable than modern thought allowed. It was not quite an answer, but it was revealing nonetheless. Elena pressed further, asking if he had ever encountered anything that made him question his understanding of reality. Viktor smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. He told her that he had seen things that should not exist according to rational thought, that he had experiences he could not explain and probably never would. He said that the world was full of mysteries, and that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, held in suspended disbelief because the truth would be too terrible to bear. Elena felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something in Viktor's words, in the intensity of his gaze, that suggested he was speaking from direct experience. She wondered what he had witnessed, what secrets he was keeping behind that carefully controlled facade. Before she could form another question, Viktor seemed to shake off his pensive mood. He smiled more warmly and suggested that it was late, that he should escort her home to ensure she arrived safely. Elena agreed, and they walked through the sleeping city, their footsteps echoing on the empty streets. When they reached her building, Viktor bid her goodnight with his usual courtesy. He took her hand and brought it briefly to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that made Elena's breath catch. His lips were cool against her skin, and for a moment their eyes met and held, and Elena felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to step into unknown territory. Then Viktor released her hand, wished her pleasant dreams, and walked away into the night. Elena stood watching until he disappeared around a corner. Then she climbed the stairs to her apartment in a daze. She lay in bed that night unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of Viktor and the strange connection she felt to him. She recognized the signs of infatuation, the way her thoughts kept returning to him even when she tried to focus on other things. She told herself it was foolish, that she barely knew him, that getting emotionally involved with someone she was collaborating with professionally was a terrible idea. Yet she could not deny what she felt. There was something between them, some charge in the air when they were together, and she was certain Viktor felt it too, no matter how carefully he maintained his distance. The weeks continued to pass, and Elena's dissertation progressed rapidly with Viktor's help. She was now working on a chapter about the ritualized violence of vampire executions, arguing that the extreme measures taken against suspected revenants served multiple social functions. They allowed communities to reclaim power in the face of inexplicable death. They created clear boundaries between the living and the dead, and they transformed passive suffering into active intervention. Viktor contributed insights that Elena never would have considered on her own. He pointed out that vampire executions were often timed to coincide with significant dates in the agricultural calendar or the church year, suggesting that they served as communal rituals that went beyond simple pest control. He noted that the mutilation of vampire corpses often involved specific acts of desecration that inverted normal funeral rites, creating a kind of anti-burial that symbolically expelled the deceased from the community of both living and dead. As Elena incorporated these ideas into her work, she became increasingly curious about the source of Viktor's knowledge. His understanding seemed to go beyond what could be gained from books and documents alone. When she remarked on this, Viktor said that he had spent time in rural areas where the old belief still persisted, where he had collected oral traditions that had never been written down. He told her about visiting remote villages in the Carpathian Mountains, in regions where modernization had come slowly and where people still spoke of supernatural threats as if they were tangible reality. He described talking with elderly villagers who claimed to remember vampire scares from their youth, who recounted in vivid detail the measures their communities had taken to protect themselves from the undead. Elena was fascinated by these accounts and asked if Viktor had any recordings or written notes from his field research. He said that he preferred to rely on memory rather than mechanical recording, that he found the act of remembering to be more faithful to the spirit of oral tradition than transcription could ever be. It was an unconventional approach, but Elena could not argue with the results. Viktor's knowledge enriched her work immeasurably, and she found herself acknowledging him in her dissertation notes, crediting him as an invaluable research consultant and source of oral historical material. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Elena noticed that Viktor seemed to become more energetic and engaged. He was always available to meet in the evenings, never canceling or rescheduling, and he seemed to have unlimited time to devote to their collaboration. She wondered what he did during the day, whether he had employment or private income that allowed him such freedom. When she asked him about this, Viktor said vaguely that he had investments and family money that provided for his needs, that he did not require traditional employment and preferred to devote his time to pursuits that interested him. It was the answer of someone who had never had to worry about money, and it placed Viktor in a social class above Elena's own middle-class academic background. Yet there was nothing snobbish or condescending in Viktor's manner. If anything, he seemed almost uncomfortable discussing wealth, as if money were a boring necessity rather than a marker of status. He lived simply as far as Elena could tell, always dressing in the same simple, elegant style, never flaunting expensive possessions or indulging in conspicuous consumption. Elena realized that despite spending so much time with Viktor, she knew very little about his personal life. She did not know where he lived, whom he spent time with when not meeting her, what his daily routine involved. He was simultaneously the person she felt closest to in Prague, and a complete mystery, known and unknown in equal measure. She decided to be more direct, to ask the questions she had been holding back. One evening at their usual cafe, she asked Viktor point-blank where he lived. He seemed amused by her directness and told her that he had an apartment in the old town, not far from where they usually met. When she asked if she could visit it sometime, perhaps to examine other family documents he might have, Viktor hesitated. He said that he valued his privacy, that he was not accustomed to having visitors, but that perhaps they could arrange something once her dissertation was further along. It was a polite deflection, and Elena recognized it as such. She decided not to push, sensing that Viktor would only withdraw further if she pressed too hard. But the exchange left her feeling frustrated and slightly hurt. She had shared so much of herself with Viktor, had told him about her family and her past, her hopes and fears for the future. Yet he remained largely opaque, revealing only what he chose to reveal and maintaining firm control over how much she could know about him. Elena tried to tell herself that it did not matter, that their relationship was professional and required no deep personal intimacy. But she knew she was lying to herself. Her feelings for Viktor had grown far beyond professional respect. She found herself thinking about him constantly, imagining scenarios where they grew closer, where the barriers between them dissolved and they could connect on a deeper level. She recognized the signs of obsession and tried to step back, to create some distance. She suggested they meet less frequently, claiming she needed more time to work independently on her dissertation. Viktor agreed easily, perhaps too easily, and they reduced their meetings to once a week. The distance helped in some ways. Elena was able to focus better on her writing, to process the material she had gathered without the distraction of Viktor's presence. But she missed him terribly, found herself counting the days until their next meeting, wondering what he did in the time they spent apart. She tried dating other people, accepting invitations from fellow graduate students, and attending social events she would normally have avoided. But every interaction felt hollow compared to her conversations with Viktor. Other men seemed boring and predictable, unable to match Viktor's intelligence and depth of knowledge. She found herself comparing everyone to him and finding them wanting. This realization troubled her. She was allowing Viktor to occupy too much space in her thoughts and emotions, giving him power over her happiness in ways that were neither healthy nor wise. She resolved to confront her feelings directly, to either act on them or let them go. At their next meeting, Elena waited until they had finished discussing her latest chapter before bringing up more personal matters. She told Viktor that she valued their collaboration and friendship deeply, that he had become important to her in ways that went beyond academic partnership. She was careful not to be too forward, not to pressure him into reciprocating feelings he might not share, but she wanted him to know that she cared for him. Viktor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, holding it gently. He told her that he was deeply touched by her words, that he had come to care for her as well, perhaps more than was wise. But he said that there were circumstances in his life that made romantic involvement complicated, things he could not easily explain. He asked her to trust that he had good reasons for maintaining distance, that it was for her protection as much as his own. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. It was both better and worse than she had feared. Viktor's feelings matched her own, but there were obstacles between them that he refused to name or explain. She asked him what these circumstances were, what could possibly be so serious that it prevented them from being together. Viktor's grip on her hand tightened slightly. He said that there were aspects of his life that she would find difficult to believe, that if she knew the truth about him, she might not want his company anymore. He said that some secrets were kept not out of dishonesty, but out of mercy, to spare others from knowledge that would only cause them pain. Elena found this cryptic response both frustrating and intriguing. Part of her wanted to demand clarity, to insist that Viktor either trust her with the truth or release her from the torment of not knowing. But another part recognized that pushing too hard might drive him away completely, that whatever secrets he kept were clearly matters of profound importance to him. She told him that she was not easily frightened, that she had spent her entire academic career studying dark and disturbing subjects, that whatever truth he was hiding could not be worse than the uncertainty of not knowing. Viktor smiled sadly and said that she was braver than she knew, but bravery alone might not be enough. They left the cafe that night with the question unresolved, hanging between them like a curtain neither dared to pull aside. Elena walked home in turmoil, her emotions a confused mixture of hope and despair, desire and fear. She felt as if she were trapped in one of the Gothic romances she had read as a teenager, caught in an impossible situation with no clear path forward. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, spending 14 and 16-hour days on her dissertation. The writing flowed with unusual ease, as if her emotional turbulence were fueling her intellectual creativity. She produced chapter after chapter, each one building on the arguments she had developed with Viktor's help. Her advisor, Professor Novak, was delighted with her progress. He told her that the dissertation was shaping up to be one of the strongest he had supervised in years, that it made genuine contributions to the field and demonstrated sophisticated theoretical thinking. He suggested that she might be ready to defend earlier than expected, perhaps by the end of the academic year. This news should have thrilled Elena, but instead it filled her with a strange sadness. Once the dissertation was complete, there would be no more reason to meet regularly with Viktor. Their collaboration would end, and she would likely return to Serbia or seek academic positions elsewhere. The connection they had forged, fragile and complicated as it was, would dissolve. At their next meeting, Elena told Viktor about her conversation with Professor Novak. Viktor congratulated her on her progress, but she thought she detected a note of melancholy in his voice. She asked him what he would do once her dissertation was finished, whether he would find another project to occupy his time. Viktor said that he had lived long enough to know that endings were necessary, that nothing remained static or permanent. He said that he would treasure the time they had spent together, that their collaboration had meant more to him than she could know, but that all things must eventually come to a close. The finality in his words sent a spike of panic through Elena. She did not want this to end, could not imagine her life without their evening meetings, without the intellectual intimacy they had developed. She told him this, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. Viktor stood and came around the table to sit beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders, and Elena leaned into him, feeling the cool solidity of his body against hers. He held her quietly for a moment, and Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks. He told her that their time together did not have to end completely, that even after her dissertation was finished, they could remain friends and colleagues. But he said that the intense connection they had developed was not sustainable, that it was burning too bright and would inevitably consume itself if they were not careful. Elena turned to look at him, her face only inches from his. She could see every detail of his features, the almost unnatural perfection of his pale skin, the way his eyes seemed to hold depths she could never fully explore. She felt an overwhelming urge to kiss him, to bridge the distance between them through physical connection. But before she could act on the impulse, Viktor gently moved away, creating space between them once more. He told her that there were lines they should not cross, boundaries that existed for good reason. His voice was firm but kind, and Elena felt both rejected and protected by his restraint. They parted shortly after, and Elena walked home feeling emotionally drained. She could not understand what held Viktor back, what mysterious circumstances made him so resistant to the possibility of being together. Every explanation she could imagine seemed insufficient to justify his caution. That night, she dreamed again of the vast library. But this time, instead of searching blindly through the stacks, she was guided by a figure she recognized as Viktor. He led her to a section she had not seen before, filled with books bound in red leather. He selected one and opened it, showing her pages illustrated with disturbing images of transformation and bloodshed. In the dream, Viktor told her that some knowledge carried a terrible price, that once certain truths were known, they could never be unknown, that ignorance was sometimes a gift rather than a curse. Elena tried to read the book he held, but the illustrations kept shifting and changing, refusing to resolve into clear images. She woke with a start, her heart pounding and her sheets tangled around her legs. The dream had felt deeply significant, like a warning or a prophecy, but she could not decipher its meaning. She lay in the darkness, thinking about Viktor and his cryptic words, about secrets and protection and the price of knowledge. Over the following days, Elena became increasingly preoccupied with solving the mystery of Viktor. She started paying closer attention to details about him that she had previously overlooked or dismissed. She noticed that she had never seen him eat or drink anything beyond tea and water. She noticed that his skin was always cool to the touch, even in warm environments. She noticed that he seemed to avoid sunlight, scheduling all their meetings for after dark and choosing venues with minimal natural lighting. These observations began to coalesce into a pattern that Elena's rational mind rejected, even as another part of her began to suspect impossible things. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that her immersion in vampire folklore was causing her to see supernatural explanations where mundane ones would suffice. Viktor's pale skin could be explained by a medical condition or simply by temperament. His preference for nighttime could reflect his work schedule or personal preference. His coolness could be poor circulation. But even as Elena constructed these rational explanations, she could not fully convince herself. There was something about Viktor that defied normal categorization, something that suggested he was not quite what he appeared to be. She decided to conduct a small experiment. At their next meeting, she suggested they meet for lunch instead of dinner, choosing a cafe with large windows that would be flooded with afternoon sunlight. Viktor hesitated before agreeing, and Elena thought she detected a flash of concern in his eyes. When the day came, Viktor arrived precisely on time, but Elena immediately noticed that he looked uncomfortable. He chose a seat with his back to the window, positioning himself so that he was largely in shadow. When Elena suggested he move to a sunnier spot, he declined, saying he had sensitive eyes and found bright light painful. Elena watched him carefully throughout their meal. He ordered food but barely touched it, pushing it around his plate in a convincing pantomime of eating. When she asked if something was wrong with the food, he said he was not particularly hungry, that he had eaten earlier. The experiment was inconclusive but suggestive. Viktor clearly preferred darkness and seemed to avoid food and sunlight. These were characteristics commonly attributed to vampires in folklore, but they could also be explained by various mundane factors. Elena felt foolish for even considering a supernatural explanation, yet she could not completely dismiss the possibility. She began researching vampires with renewed focus, but this time from a different angle. Instead of examining them as folklore and metaphor, she looked into historical accounts that claimed to document actual vampires. She reread Brother Andreas's manuscript and Vaclav's journal with fresh eyes, paying attention to the details that suggested these men believed they were encountering genuine supernatural beings rather than simply disturbed corpses or victims of disease. The more she read, the more she noticed certain consistencies in the descriptions of vampires across different time periods and regions. They were said to be pale and cold, to avoid sunlight, to consume blood rather than food, to possess unusual strength and speed, to be capable of mesmerizing their victims. These traits appeared so frequently in independent sources that Elena began to wonder if they might be based on observation of actual phenomena rather than pure invention. She felt herself sliding toward a conclusion she knew was absurd, yet she could not pull back. Everything she knew about Viktor aligned with these historical descriptions. His pallor, his nocturnal habits, his mysterious longevity of knowledge, his reluctance to eat, his cool skin, the almost hypnotic quality of his presence, all of it fit the pattern. Elena tried to test this hypothesis indirectly. She asked Viktor about his family history, about how far back the Zerner line could be traced. Viktor said that his family was very old, that they had been in Bohemia for many centuries, but he was vague about specific details. When she pressed for more information, he changed the subject with practiced ease. She asked him about his own childhood and education, hoping to establish a timeline that would prove he was a normal human being. Viktor provided some details. He had grown up in Prague, had been educated privately, had traveled extensively, but nothing that established his age or confirmed that his life followed a normal human trajectory. Elena felt as if she were going mad. The rational part of her mind insisted that vampires did not exist, that she was allowing her research to contaminate her perception of reality. But another part, the part that had been transformed by her time with Viktor, whispered that the world was stranger than she had been taught to believe. She decided to confront Viktor directly. She could not continue in this state of uncertainty, could not maintain the pretense of normal collaboration while harboring such extreme suspicions. At their next meeting, she waited until they were alone in a quiet corner of their usual cafe before broaching the subject. She told Viktor that she had been thinking about the nature of vampire folklore, about how consistent certain details were across different cultures and time periods. She said that sometimes she wondered if these consistencies reflected something real, some actual phenomenon that had been observed and recorded, even if not properly understood. Viktor listened without interrupting, his pale eyes fixed on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her what she really wanted to know. Elena took a deep breath. She asked him if he believed that vampires actually existed, not as metaphor or superstition, but as real beings that walked among the living. Viktor's expression became very serious. He said that belief was a complicated thing, that what people believed to be real often shaped their experience of reality in profound ways. He said that if vampires did exist, they would probably not match the sensationalized versions found in popular culture, that they would likely be far more complex and tragic than simple monsters. It was an evasive answer, and Elena pressed him further. She asked him directly if he was human. The question hung in the air between them, and Elena saw something shift in Viktor's eyes. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing depths of emotion he normally kept hidden. He looked at her with an expression of profound sadness, and something that might have been relief. He told her that he had hoped to spare her this knowledge, that he had tried to maintain distance precisely to avoid this moment. But he said that he could not lie to her, not when she had asked him directly. Viktor said that he was not human, not in the conventional sense. He said that he had lived far longer than any mortal should, that he had seen empires rise and fall, that he had been transformed into something other centuries ago and could not return to what he once was. Elena felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her. Part of her had suspected, had been building toward this realization, but hearing Viktor confirm it made it terrifyingly real. She asked him if he was a vampire, and Viktor nodded slowly. He told her that he disliked the term, that it carried too much baggage from folklore and fiction, but that it was essentially accurate. He said that he was a creature that required blood to survive, that he could not tolerate sunlight, that he had abilities beyond normal human capacity. He said that he had been trying to protect her from this truth because knowledge of his nature had, historically, brought nothing but sorrow to those he cared about. Elena sat in stunned silence, her mind racing to process what she was hearing. Every instinct told her to run, to escape from this impossible revelation. Yet she remained seated, held in place by the connection she felt to Viktor, by the certainty that despite everything he had just revealed, he meant her no harm. She asked him how old he was, and Viktor said he had been born in 1653 and transformed in 1680, making him over 300 years old. She asked him how he had become a vampire, and he said that it had not been his choice, that he had been attacked and transformed against his will by another of his kind. The story poured out of Viktor then, as if a dam had broken. He told her about his human life, about growing up in Prague during a time of religious conflict and political upheaval. He told her about the night he was attacked, about the terror and pain of transformation, about waking to find himself changed in fundamental and irreversible ways. He described the early years of his new existence, the struggle to understand what he had become and how to survive. He told her about learning to hunt without killing, about developing the discipline to feed only enough to sustain himself without draining his victims dry. He told her about the profound loneliness of immortality, about watching everyone he loved grow old and die while he remained unchanged. Viktor said that he had spent centuries trying to understand what he was, researching vampire lore and history in an attempt to make sense of his condition. This was why he knew so much about the subject, why he could speak with such authority about regional variations in belief and practice. He had lived through many of the incidents documented in historical accounts, had even known some of the vampire hunters whose writings survived. He told her about Vaclav Zerner, his great-great-grandfather, who had never known that his descendant had become the very thing he devoted his life to destroying. Vaclav had died believing he had made his community safer, never realizing that vampires could hide among the living, could appear normal and unthreatening when they chose. Elena listened to all of this in a state of profound shock. The academic part of her mind was cataloging details, noting how Viktor's account compared to historical records and folklore. But on a deeper level, she was grappling with the existential implications of what she was learning. Everything she thought she knew about reality had to be reassessed in light of this revelation. She asked Viktor if he had killed people, if he had taken human lives to sustain himself. Viktor did not flinch from the question. He said that in the early years, when he did not understand how to control his hunger, he had killed. The admission was heavy with guilt and regret. He said that those deaths haunted him still, that he could remember each victim, that their faces visited him in his rare moments of sleep. But he said that he had learned over time to feed without killing, to take only what he needed and to ensure his victims remembered nothing of the encounter. He used a kind of hypnotic ability that vampires possessed, a way of clouding human minds and making them suggestible. He would feed and then erase the memory, leaving his victims with nothing more than a vague sense of lost time and mild fatigue. Elena asked him if he had fed from her, and Viktor met her eyes directly as he answered. He said that he had never touched her in that way, that he had been determined to keep her safe from that aspect of his nature. He said that his feelings for her made the thought of feeding from her repulsive, that it would be a violation of the trust and connection they had developed. The conversation continued deep into the night, Elena asking questions and Viktor answering with a candor that suggested profound relief at finally being able to speak honestly. He told her about the limitations of his existence, about how sunlight would burn him, how certain religious symbols and holy objects caused him pain, how he could not cross running water without great effort. He told her that many of the folkloric protections against vampires were based in reality. Garlic did repel his kind, though it was not lethal, merely unpleasant. Stakes through the heart would kill a vampire, as would decapitation or burning. The rituals described in Vaclav's journal would indeed have destroyed a vampire, though Viktor noted sadly that they had likely also destroyed many corpses that posed no supernatural threat. As dawn approached, Viktor said that he needed to leave to find shelter before the sun rose. Elena asked where he went during the day, and he told her about his apartment, a space he had carefully modified to block all natural light. He slept during daylight hours, not in a coffin as folklore suggested, but in a normal bed, in a profound stillness that resembled death more than sleep. Before he left, Viktor took Elena's hands in his own cool grip. He told her that he understood if she needed time to process what she had learned, that he would not blame her if she decided to end their acquaintance. He said that knowing what he was put her in potential danger, not from him but from others of his kind who would see her knowledge as a threat. Elena asked if there were other vampires, and Viktor said yes, that there were more than humans realized, living hidden among mortal populations across the world. Most kept to themselves, observing strict rules about feeding and concealment. But there were some who were less careful, less concerned with maintaining the masquerade that protected their kind. He told her to be careful, to trust no one completely, to be aware that the world now appeared different than it had before their conversation. Knowledge of the supernatural was both power and vulnerability, and she would need to navigate carefully to avoid becoming a target. Then Viktor was gone, moving with the inhuman speed Elena had noticed but never fully registered. She sat alone in the cafe as the staff began to prepare for morning service, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. Over the following days, Elena struggled to integrate her new understanding of reality with the worldview she had held all her life. She went through the motions of her daily routine, attending seminars, meeting with her advisor, working on her dissertation, but everything felt surreal and dreamlike. She kept expecting to wake up and find that the conversation with Viktor had been an elaborate fantasy, a stress-induced hallucination born from too much time studying dark folklore. But the evidence of Viktor's true nature was undeniable once she knew to look for it. She reread their conversations with fresh understanding, seeing how carefully he had constructed his responses, how he had revealed truth while appearing to speak metaphorically. His extensive knowledge of historical events made sense now. He had lived through them. His understanding of vampire psychology was based on centuries of self-examination. Every detail aligned once she accepted the impossible premise. Elena found herself in a profound philosophical crisis. Her entire academic career was based on the assumption that folklore reflected human psychology and social dynamics, not actual supernatural phenomena. If vampires were real, what did that mean for her research? Was she studying metaphor and projection, or was she documenting encounters with actual creatures of the night? She continued working on her dissertation, but now with a strange double consciousness. She wrote her analysis as planned, discussing vampire folklore in terms of trauma processing and cultural symbolism. But in her mind, she was constantly comparing the folklore to what Viktor had told her, noting where the myths aligned with reality and where they diverged. It occurred to her that this dual perspective might actually strengthen her work. Understanding the reality behind the folklore allowed her to see more clearly how humans had processed their encounters with the supernatural, how they had tried to make sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. The folklore was a kind of translation, converting the incomprehensible into narrative forms that could be shared and understood within cultural frameworks. She decided to meet with Viktor again, despite the risks. She could not simply walk away from him, not after everything they had shared, not when she was perhaps the only person in his life who knew the truth about him. She sent him a message asking to meet, and he responded immediately, agreeing to come to her apartment that evening. Elena prepared for his visit with nervous anticipation. She cleaned her small apartment and made tea, then realized with a start that Viktor probably would not drink it. She had never seen him consume anything beyond water, and now she understood why. Food and drink were performances for him, social rituals he went through to appear normal, but they provided no sustenance. When Viktor arrived, precisely at the agreed-upon time, Elena saw him with new eyes. She noticed details she had missed before, the way he moved with fluid grace, the preternatural stillness he could maintain, the way his eyes sometimes caught light in an almost feline manner. Yet beneath these subtle markers of otherness, he was still Viktor, still the person who had helped her research, who had listened to her ideas, who had become essential to her life. They sat in her small living room, and Elena asked the questions that had been building in her mind since their last conversation. She asked Viktor what it felt like to be a vampire, whether he experienced emotions the way humans did, whether he had memories of being mortal. Viktor answered thoughtfully, seeming to appreciate her genuine curiosity. He said that he remembered being human, though the memories had faded over time like old photographs losing their color. He said that he still felt emotions, perhaps even more intensely than mortals, because he had so much time to reflect on them. Love, sorrow, joy, rage, all these were still part of his experience, though they were complicated by the knowledge of his own immortality and difference. Elena asked him about the physical sensations of being a vampire. Viktor said that most things felt muted compared to his human life. Food had no taste, physical comfort meant little, temperature changes barely registered, but blood was different. Blood was vivid and overwhelming, carrying not just nourishment, but also emotions and experiences from the donor. When he fed, he glimpsed the inner life of his victim, feeling echoes of their joys and sorrows, their hopes and fears. He said that this was both the blessing and curse of his existence. He needed blood to survive, but taking it meant experiencing the humanity of his victims, being reminded of everything he had lost. It created a profound intimacy that was ultimately meaningless, since he erased all memory of the encounter from his victim's mind. Elena asked if he had ever formed relationships with humans who knew what he was, and Viktor's expression became very sad. He said that he had tried centuries ago, but that it always ended in tragedy. The human would eventually age and die while he remained unchanged, or they would be unable to live with the knowledge of what he was, or they would want to be transformed themselves, which Viktor refused to do. He said that transforming someone into a vampire was the worst thing he could imagine doing to another person. It was condemning them to an existence they had not chosen, cutting them off from human connection, cursing them with eternal hunger and isolation. He had sworn long ago that he would never create another vampire, that he would rather face true death than inflict his condition on someone else. This revelation answered one of the questions that had been nagging at Elena. She asked Viktor why he seemed so resistant to developing a romantic relationship with her, and he said that it was precisely because he cared for her. Any relationship between them would be inherently unequal and temporary. She would age while he remained frozen in time. She would eventually want things he could not give her, a normal life, children, the simple pleasure of growing old together. Elena understood the logic of his argument, but it did not change how she felt. She told Viktor that she was willing to accept the limitations, that the time they could have together was worth the pain of eventual separation. She said that trying to protect her from future hurt by denying their connection in the present was a kind of arrogance, assuming she could not make her own choices about what risks she was willing to take. Viktor listened but did not immediately respond. Elena could see the conflict in his expression, the war between desire and restraint. Finally, he told her that he needed time to think, that this decision could not be made impulsively. They spent the rest of the evening talking about other things, her dissertation progress, his memories of historical events, the nature of existence and meaning in an absurd universe. Despite the strangeness of the situation, Elena felt more comfortable and natural with Viktor than she ever had. The revelation of his true nature had paradoxically made their connection feel more honest and authentic. When Viktor left before dawn, he kissed Elena goodbye for the first time. It was chaste and brief, his cool lips barely brushing hers, but it sent electricity through her entire body. She stood in her doorway watching him disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, feeling as if she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The following weeks were strange and wonderful. Viktor seemed to have accepted that their connection was inevitable, that fighting against it only caused both of them pain. They began spending more time together, meeting almost every night, sometimes working on Elena's dissertation, but often just talking or walking through the quiet streets of Prague. Viktor showed Elena aspects of the city she had never seen, taking her to places only accessible at night, to underground chambers and hidden courtyards that most tourists never discovered. He told her stories about the city's past, about events he had witnessed firsthand, about the ways Prague had changed and remained the same across centuries. Elena found herself falling deeper in love, not despite Viktor's vampiric nature, but somehow because of it. There was something profoundly romantic about the tragedy of his existence, about the way he had maintained his humanity despite everything that had been taken from him. He was proof that monsters could be more human than humans, that grace and compassion were choices rather than intrinsic qualities. Yet even as their relationship deepened, Elena was aware of the complications and dangers. Viktor told her about the society of vampires that existed beneath the surface of human civilization, about the rules and hierarchies that governed their kind. Most vampires lived in isolation, avoiding each other except when necessary. But there were some who organized into covens or courts, who saw themselves as superior to humans and resented the need to hide their true nature. Viktor said that his relationship with Elena, if discovered by certain vampires, could put them both in danger. The revelation of vampire existence to humans was the greatest taboo of vampire society, punishable by death for both the vampire and the human involved. Viktor was taking a tremendous risk by trusting Elena with the truth, and she was taking an equal risk by choosing to remain in his life. This danger added an edge of urgency to their time together. Elena found herself acutely aware that each moment with Viktor might be their last, that at any time they could be discovered and separated permanently. It made every conversation, every touch, every shared experience feel precious and irreplaceable. Elena's dissertation was nearly complete now, and she was beginning to think about her defense and what would come after. Professor Novak wanted her to consider applying for postdoctoral positions, to continue her research and establish herself in the field. But Elena found it hard to care about her academic future when she was living in a reality so far removed from conventional scholarship. She wondered what it would mean to spend her life studying folklore while knowing that the subject of her study was real. Could she continue to publish academic work that treated vampires as myth and metaphor while being in a relationship with an actual vampire? The duplicity felt uncomfortable, yet revealing the truth was impossible. No one would believe her, and even if they did, it would violate Viktor's trust and put him in terrible danger. Viktor sensed her internal conflict and told her that she should pursue her academic career without hesitation. He said that her analysis of vampire folklore was valuable precisely because it examined the human response to the supernatural, the way people made meaning from encounters they could not fully understand. Her work did not become less true because vampires were real. It simply operated on a different level of truth. This perspective helped Elena find peace with the situation. She could be both a scholar and someone who knew the deeper reality behind her subject. The two roles were not contradictory, but complementary, each enriching the other. As winter turned to early spring, Elena successfully defended her dissertation. The committee was impressed by her work, praising its originality and rigor. Professor Novak was particularly enthusiastic, telling her afterward that he expected the dissertation to be published as a book and to establish her reputation in the field. Viktor attended the defense, sitting quietly in the back of the room. When Elena spoke about the ritualistic aspects of vampire hunts, about the ways communities use these practices to process trauma and re-establish boundaries, she caught his eye and saw profound sadness in his expression. She realized that she was talking about his ancestors, about the very people who would have destroyed him if they had known what he was. After the defense, there was a small celebration at a local pub. Elena's fellow graduate students and professors congratulated her, bought her drinks, and talked about future collaborations. Viktor remained on the periphery, politely declining offers of food and drink, watching Elena with those pale, ancient eyes. When the celebration wound down, Viktor and Elena walked along the Vltava river, watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark water. Elena felt a sense of completion mixed with uncertainty. Her dissertation was finished, her immediate academic goal achieved. But she had no clear path forward, no sense of what came next. Viktor asked her what she wanted to do now, and Elena realized she did not know. She could apply for academic positions, but the thought of leaving Prague, of leaving Viktor, was unbearable. She could try to find work in the city, but opportunities for folklore scholars were limited. She felt suspended between possibilities, unable to commit to any particular future. Viktor was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her if she had ever considered that there might be other options, paths she had not yet imagined. Elena asked what he meant, and Viktor said that he could offer her something that no academic position ever could. Time. Elena felt her heart begin to race as she understood what Viktor was suggesting. He was offering her transformation, offering to make her a vampire, to give her the same immortal existence he had. She had known this possibility existed in theory, but hearing Viktor's voice, it made it terrifyingly real. She asked him if he was serious, reminding him of what he had said about never wanting to create another vampire. Viktor said that his feelings about transformation had not changed. He still believed it was a curse rather than a gift. But he also recognized that the choice should belong to the person being transformed, that Elena had the right to decide for herself whether immortality was worth the price. He told her to think carefully before answering, to consider all the implications. If she became a vampire, she would have to leave behind her human life, would have to fake her death and sever connections with family and friends. She would need to learn to hunt and feed, to live in darkness, to watch everyone she had known grow old and die. She would be cut off from human community in fundamental ways, existing always on the margins of society. But she would also have time, centuries, perhaps millennia, to pursue knowledge and understanding. She could continue her research indefinitely, could witness history unfold rather than just studying it in books. And she would have Viktor, not for a handful of years cut short by mortality, but for as long as they both chose to remain together. Elena told Viktor she needed time to consider, and he said he would wait for her answer, that this decision could not be rushed. They continued walking in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Over the following weeks, Elena wrestled with the choice Viktor had laid before her. She made lists of advantages and disadvantages, tried to imagine what immortality would actually feel like, consulted vampire folklore to see what wisdom it might offer. But ultimately, she knew that this was not a decision that could be made through rational analysis alone. She thought about her human life, about her family in Serbia whom she saw only occasionally, about her friends and colleagues who would mourn her if she disappeared. She thought about the small pleasures of mortal existence, good food, warm sunshine, the natural cycle of seasons matching the cycle of life. These would all be lost or fundamentally altered by transformation. But she also thought about the alternative, growing old while Viktor remained unchanged, watching her body decline while his stayed frozen in time, eventually dying and leaving him to continue alone through the centuries. That future seemed even more unbearable than the sacrifices transformation would require. Elena realized that her decision had perhaps already been made, that from the moment Viktor had revealed what he was, she had been moving toward this choice. She loved him in a way that transcended normal human romance, and she wanted to remain with him regardless of the cost. She told Viktor her decision on a night in early April, when the first flowers were beginning to bloom in the city's gardens. They were sitting on a bench near the river, and Elena took his cool hand in hers as she spoke. She said that she wanted to be transformed, that she wanted to share his immortal existence, that she would rather face an eternity of darkness with him than a normal lifetime without him. Viktor's expression was complex, relief mixed with sorrow, joy shadowed by guilt. He told her that he would grant her request, but only after she had completed certain preparations. She would need to arrange her human affairs, Create a plausible explanation for her disappearance. Ensure that her family would not be left in agonizing uncertainty about her fate. He said that the transformation itself was dangerous and painful, that there was a small chance she might not survive it. He said that she would need to be strong, to trust him completely, to surrender herself to a process that would feel like dying because, in a sense, it was exactly that. Over the following month, Elena prepared for her transformation with meticulous care. She told her family that she had been offered a research position in a remote region where communication would be limited. She transferred her dissertation materials and research notes to digital storage that she could access later. She created a will leaving her few possessions to her parents and siblings. She also spent time simply living, trying to savor human experiences she would soon lose. She ate elaborate meals, spent time in the sun, listened to her heartbeat, paid attention to all the small sensations of embodied mortality. She wanted to remember what it had felt like to be human, to carry those memories with her into whatever came next. Viktor watched her preparations with quiet support, answering her questions about what to expect, but not trying to influence her decision. He had given her one final opportunity to change her mind, and when she had affirmed her choice, he had accepted it without further argument. On the night chosen for her transformation, Viktor took Elena to his apartment, a space she had never seen despite months of knowing him. It was located in a medieval building in the oldest part of the city, accessed through a narrow courtyard and up a spiraling stone staircase. The apartment itself was beautiful but spare, furnished with antiques that looked as if they belonged in museums. Viktor had prepared a room for the transformation, a windowless space in the center of the apartment, where Elena could recover without risk of sunlight exposure. The room contained a bed, some candles for light, and nothing else. It was both stark and solemn, like a chapel dedicated to dark rituals. Viktor explained the mechanics of transformation with clinical precision. He would need to drain Elena nearly to the point of death, taking so much blood that her body began to shut down. Then, while she was on the threshold of death, he would have her drink his blood, which would trigger the supernatural change. The process would take several days, during which Elena would experience fever, delirium, and extreme pain as her body died and reformed into something new. He told her that she might hate him during the transformation, that the pain would be so intense she would beg for it to stop, but that he would have to continue regardless. He asked her one final time if she was certain, and when Elena said yes, he kissed her deeply, perhaps trying to memorize the feeling of her warm, living lips against his. Then the transformation began. Viktor's bite was not gentle or romantic as folklore suggested. It was efficient and painful, his fangs sinking deep into the artery at her neck. Elena gasped at the sensation. It felt like ice and fire simultaneously, like being emptied and filled at the same time. She felt her blood being drawn out of her in long pulls, felt her heartbeat slowing as her body tried desperately to compensate for the loss. The room began to blur and spin around her. She could hear Viktor's voice speaking softly, though she could not make out the words. Her body felt simultaneously heavy and weightless, as if she were sinking and floating at once. Pain radiated from her neck through her entire body, and she understood that she was dying, that this was what death felt like. When she was on the verge of losing consciousness, Viktor pulled back. She felt him lift her gently and carry her to the bed. Then he was pressing his wrist to her lips, and she tasted his blood, cold and sweet, and utterly unlike anything human. Some instinct made her drink, and as Viktor's blood entered her system, the transformation truly began. The pain Elena had felt before was nothing compared to what came next. It felt as if her entire body was being torn apart and rebuilt at the cellular level. Fire raced through her veins, her bones ached with impossible pressure. Her skin felt like it was being flayed from her flesh. She screamed until her voice gave out, thrashed until Viktor had to hold her down to keep her from injuring herself. Time lost all meaning. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of Viktor's cool hands on her forehead, sometimes lost in fever dreams where she relived her entire human life in fragmentary flashes. She dreamed of her grandmother telling her vampire stories, of walking across the Charles Bridge on her first day in Prague, of the moment she had first seen Viktor watching her from the shadows. Sometimes she forgot who she was or why this was happening. The pain was so overwhelming that it became her entire reality, and she could not remember a time when she had not been suffering. She begged Viktor to make it stop, to kill her or save her, anything to end the torment. But he held her and whispered that she needed to endure, that the transformation was working, that she would emerge from this changed but intact. After what seemed like an eternity but was actually 3 days, the pain began to subside. Elena found herself able to think more clearly, to be aware of her surroundings without the haze of agony. She realized that her body felt different, that sensations had changed in fundamental ways. She became aware of sounds she had never heard before, the rustling of rats in the walls, the creaking of floorboards in apartments far above and below, the whisper of wind through cracks in the stone. She could smell everything with impossible precision, the age of the wood in the furniture, the residue of meals cooked in neighboring apartments, the complex scent of Viktor's presence. And she could feel the hunger. It started as a hollow ache in her stomach but quickly spread through her entire body. She needed blood with a desperation that was both physical and spiritual, as if her very soul was crying out for sustenance only blood could provide. Viktor helped her sit up, and Elena caught sight of herself in a mirror across the room. She looked like herself but also transformed. Her skin was paler, almost luminous, and her eyes had changed to a pale gray similar to Viktor's. She looked beautiful in a cold, inhuman way, like a statue carved from marble and given the semblance of life. Viktor told her that she had survived the transformation, that she was now a vampire, that her human life had ended and her immortal existence had begun. He said that they needed to feed soon, that she needed to learn to hunt and to control the hunger that would now be her constant companion. That first hunt was both exhilarating and horrifying. Viktor took Elena into the city streets, showing her how to identify potential victims, how to approach them without arousing suspicion, how to use the hypnotic power that all vampires possess to make humans compliant and forgetful. They found a young man walking alone through a dark alley, probably on his way home from a late shift. Viktor demonstrated the technique, approaching casually, making eye contact, speaking in a low, soothing voice that bypassed the victim's conscious defenses. Within moments, the man was in a trance-like state, docile and unresisting. Viktor fed first, showing Elena how much to take and how to seal the wounds so they would heal quickly and leave minimal marks. Then it was her turn. Elena hesitated, revolted by what she was about to do. But the hunger was overwhelming, drowning out her moral reservations beneath waves of desperate need. She bit into the man's neck, and the taste of blood flooded her senses. It was nothing like she had imagined, not metallic or unpleasant, but rich and complex, carrying flavors and sensations she had no words for. She could taste the man's emotions, his tiredness and loneliness, his simple contentment at being done with work for the day. She could feel his life force flowing into her, filling the void the transformation had created. She drank until Viktor gently pulled her away, warning her that she was taking too much. With effort, Elena released the man, sealing the wound as Viktor had shown her. They left him slumped against a wall, sleeping peacefully, with no memory of what had happened beyond a vague sense of tiredness. As they walked away, Elena felt both elated and disgusted with herself. The blood had satisfied her hunger in ways she could not have imagined, had made her feel more alive than she ever had as a human. But she had also violated another person's autonomy, had taken from him without permission, had reduced him to mere sustenance for her supernatural needs. Viktor understood her conflict without her having to explain. He told her that this guilt would fade with time, that she would learn to see feeding as a necessary act rather than a moral failure. He said that they were predators now, operating according to different rules than human morality allowed. But he also said that they could choose to be as ethical as possible within their limitations, to take only what they needed and to harm their victims as little as they could. The following weeks were a period of intense adjustment and learning. Viktor taught Elena how to navigate her new existence, how to avoid sunlight, how to find shelter during the day, how to interact with humans without revealing her true nature. He taught her to control her enhanced physical abilities, to move with normal human slowness when necessary, to modulate her strength so she did not accidentally break things or hurt people. He also taught her about vampire society, about the rules and customs that governed interactions between their kind. Most vampires were solitary by nature, preferring isolation to the complications of vampire politics. But there were social structures, informal networks of vampires who shared territory and information. Viktor introduced Elena to a few other vampires in Prague, ancient beings who assessed her with cool, measuring gazes and accepted her only because Viktor vouched for her. Elena found these encounters unsettling. The other vampires seemed to have lost much of their humanity over centuries of existence. They viewed humans as little more than livestock, had no interest in human culture or achievement beyond what was necessary to blend in. They seemed to exist in a state of profound boredom, going through the motions of immortal life without joy or purpose. Viktor was different. Despite his age, he had maintained his curiosity and engagement with the world. He read voraciously, followed developments in art and science, found meaning in observation and understanding. He told Elena that this was why he had survived so long while remaining relatively sane. He had refused to surrender his intellectual and emotional life to the emptiness of mere existence. This gave Elena hope that she could maintain her own sense of self despite the transformation. She continued to think about folklore and history, to analyze her new condition through the lens of her academic training. She realized that she now had the opportunity to become the world's foremost expert on vampire folklore, since she could bring both scholarly rigor and lived experience to her analysis. But she also recognized that she could never publish this knowledge, could never share her unique perspective with the academic world. Her transformation had cut her off from human scholarly community, just as surely as it had cut her off from human society generally. She would have to find other ways to use her knowledge and satisfy her intellectual curiosity. As spring turned to summer, Elena and Viktor settled into the rhythms of immortal life together. They spent their nights exploring Prague and the surrounding regions, their days in Viktor's apartment, reading and talking and making love in the cool darkness. Elena found that physical intimacy with Viktor was far more intense now that they were both vampires, that the connection between them was no longer complicated by the difference between mortal and immortal. She did not regret her transformation, despite the losses it entailed. She missed the sun and the taste of food, missed her family and the possibility of a normal human future. But what she had gained felt worth the sacrifice. She had Viktor's companionship for eternity, had escaped the tyranny of aging and death, had access to experiences and knowledge that mortal life could never provide. Yet Elena also recognized that immortality brought its own challenges. Time stretched out before her in ways that were simultaneously liberating and terrifying. She would have centuries to pursue understanding, but she would also have to find ways to maintain meaning and purpose across epochs of existence. She would need to continually reinvent herself, to find new interests and engagements, to resist the boredom and despair that seemed to afflict so many ancient vampires. Viktor helped her navigate these challenges, sharing the wisdom he had accumulated over 3 centuries of existence. He told her that the key to meaningful immortality was to remain engaged with the world, to care about things beyond mere survival, to maintain connections even knowing that most would eventually end. He said that the alternative was a kind of living death, an existence devoid of feeling or purpose, and that he had seen too many vampires succumb to that emptiness. Elena took his advice to heart. She continued her scholarly pursuits, now with the advantage of immortal time to devote to research. She began collecting vampire folklore from around the world, traveling with Viktor to different regions, and interviewing elderly people who remembered the old beliefs. She documented oral traditions that had never been written down, preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost. She also began working on a secret project, a comprehensive history of vampires written from the inside, documenting the reality of vampire existence across centuries and cultures. She knew she could never publish this work during her lifetime, but perhaps centuries from now, when the world had changed in ways she could not yet imagine, her manuscript might find an audience. Viktor supported her work enthusiastically, contributing his own memories and observations to her research. They became true intellectual partners, collaborating on a project that bridged scholarship and lived experience in unprecedented ways. As Elena's first year as a vampire drew to a close, she reflected on how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been an ordinary graduate student studying folklore, believing vampires were nothing more than myth and metaphor. Now she was a vampire herself, living in the shadows of Prague with her immortal partner, pursuing knowledge that no human scholar could access. She thought about the strange path that had brought her to this point, her interest in folklore, her move to Prague, her chance encounter with Viktor on the Charles Bridge. It seemed impossible that all of this had been random coincidence. Perhaps there was some pattern to existence, some underlying structure that guided events toward meaningful outcomes. Or perhaps she was simply creating narrative meaning from random events, finding patterns where none existed. This was, after all, what humans did. They told stories to make sense of chaos, created myths to explain the inexplicable, transformed raw experience into meaningful narrative. As a scholar, Elena had studied this process extensively. Now as a vampire, she had become part of the very mythology she had once analyzed from a safe academic distance. She was both observer and participant, studying vampire folklore while simultaneously creating it through her own existence. This dual perspective gave her insights that no purely human or purely vampire observer could achieve. She understood both the human need to categorize and explain the supernatural and the vampire experience of existing as the supernatural made flesh. She could see how folklore both reflected and distorted vampire reality, how it captured certain truths while obscuring others. Viktor told her that this was perhaps why their relationship worked so well. Elena brought her human scholarly training to vampire existence, while Viktor had maintained enough humanity over the centuries to appreciate her perspective. Together, they formed a kind of bridge between human and vampire worlds, each enriching the other's understanding. As Elena looked toward her immortal future, she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She did not know what the coming centuries would bring, what changes she would witness or experience. But she knew that whatever came, she would face it with Viktor beside her, and that their shared journey through eternity would be worth whatever challenges it entailed. She had transformed from human to vampire, from mortal scholar to immortal observer. But perhaps the most profound transformation had been internal, from someone who studied life at a distance to someone who embraced existence in all its complexity and contradiction. Elena had spent her human life analyzing vampire folklore, trying to understand why these legends persisted and what they revealed about human psychology. Now she understood that the persistence of vampire mythology reflected a deep human intuition about the world, that there were things beyond rational comprehension, that the boundary between natural and supernatural was thinner than modern thought allowed, that monsters walked among humanity, hidden in plain sight. She had become living proof that folklore sometimes told truths that science and reason dismissed. She had crossed from the world of academic analysis into the world of lived supernatural experience. And in doing so, she had discovered that both perspectives were necessary for genuine understanding. That truth required both distance and participation, both skepticism and acceptance. As a human scholar, Elena had treated vampire folklore as metaphor and cultural artifact. As a vampire, she now knew it was also memory and warning, testimony and witness. The stories her grandmother had told, the accounts she had studied in medieval manuscripts, the rituals documented in Vaclav's journal, all of these contained fragments of truth about actual encounters with the undead. but they also contain distortions and misunderstandings, shaped by human fear and the need to create narratives that made sense within cultural frameworks. The reality of vampire existence was both more mundane and more complex than folklore suggested. Vampires were not demonic monsters or romantic heroes, but something in between, supernatural beings who had once been human, struggling to maintain meaning and humanity across the long span of immortal existence. Elena's transformation had given her access to this reality, but it had also raised new questions. If vampires existed, what other supernatural beings might be real? Were werewolves and demons, ghosts and spirits, also more than mere folklore? Viktor suggested that the supernatural world was far more diverse than vampire lore alone suggested, that vampires were just one species among many that existed at the margins of human awareness. This realization opened up new directions for Elena's research. She began studying other forms of folklore with the same dual consciousness she brought to vampire mythology. She looked for patterns that might indicate genuine supernatural phenomena rather than pure invention. She sought out encounters with other supernatural beings, building a comprehensive understanding of the hidden world that existed alongside mundane reality. Over the years and decades that followed, Elena became something unique, a vampire scholar of the supernatural, bringing academic rigor to subjects that academia dismissed as superstition. She accumulated vast knowledge about the hidden structures of reality, about the rules and limitations of different supernatural species, about the history of interactions between the natural and supernatural worlds. Viktor watched her intellectual development with pride and joy. He had lived for centuries, but had never encountered anyone quite like Elena, someone who could bring fresh perspective to subjects he thought he fully understood. She helped him see his own existence in new ways, to recognize patterns and meanings he had missed despite his long experience. Their relationship deepened and matured across the years. They remained lovers and partners, but they also became true companions in the fullest sense. Two beings who understood each other completely, who challenged and supported each other, who found in each other the perfect complement to their own strengths and weaknesses. They traveled extensively, visiting regions where vampire folklore was particularly rich, collecting stories and conducting interviews. They witnessed historical events firsthand, watching as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, as technology transformed human society in unprecedented ways. They adapted to each new era, learning to blend in with changing cultures while maintaining their essential selves. Elena discovered that immortality was both gift and burden, exactly as Viktor had warned. She watched human friends and colleagues age and die, experienced the pain of outliving everyone she had known in her mortal life. She witnessed terrible events, wars and genocides, environmental destruction and social collapse, and felt the weight of watching humanity repeat its mistakes across generations. But she also experienced profound beauty and wonder. She saw the aurora borealis dancing across northern skies, watched the sun set over the Sahara from a safe distance as twilight approached, listened to music that moved her to tears despite her vampire nature. She discovered that the world was endlessly fascinating, that no amount of time could exhaust the possibilities for new experience and understanding. And always there was Viktor. He remained her anchor and her compass, the person who understood her most deeply and loved her most completely. Their relationship was not perfect. They argued and disagreed, experienced periods of tension and distance, but it endured because it was built on genuine respect and shared purpose. As decades turned to centuries, Elena began to understand what Viktor had meant about the importance of maintaining engagement with the world. She saw other vampires succumb to ennui and despair, watched as ancient beings lost interest in existence, and walked into sunlight or sought other forms of destruction. She recognized that immortality without meaning was perhaps worse than death, that an eternity of empty existence was a kind of hell. She vowed that she would never surrender to that emptiness, that she would always find new questions to explore and new knowledge to pursue. Her scholarly nature, which had defined her human life, became the foundation of her immortal existence. She was not just a vampire, but a vampire scholar, and this dual identity gave her purpose that transcended mere survival. Viktor told her that she had saved him as much as he had transformed her. Before meeting Elena, he had been slowly succumbing to the existential exhaustion that afflicted so many ancient vampires. But her enthusiasm and curiosity had reinvigorated him, had reminded him why existence could be meaningful and worth maintaining. She had given him a reason to engage with the world beyond simple habit or survival instinct. This mutual sustenance became the foundation of their enduring bond. They were not just romantic partners, but intellectual collaborators and spiritual companions. They needed each other not just emotionally, but existentially, each providing the other with purpose and meaning that made immortality bearable. As the 21st century progressed, Elena and Viktor watched as the world changed in ways neither had anticipated. The rise of digital technology and global communication networks, the increasing awareness of climate change and environmental crisis, the political upheavals and social transformations, all of these created new challenges and opportunities for immortal beings trying to maintain their cover while engaging with human society. They adapted as they had always adapted, learning new technologies and social customs, finding ways to participate in human culture without revealing their true nature. Elena created false identities and fictional life histories, carefully maintaining the illusion that she was a normal human being of appropriate age. She published scholarly work under various pseudonyms, contributing to academic discourse without claiming credit or building a reputation that would attract too much attention. Viktor supported her efforts while pursuing his own interests. He had developed a passion for preserving historical sites and artifacts, using his wealth to protect places and objects that held meaning from his long life. He became a patron of museums and archives, donating materials from his extensive personal collection, while keeping the most significant items hidden from public view. Together, they built a life that balanced secrecy and engagement, isolation and connection. They maintained relationships with other vampires, but also found ways to interact with humans, to contribute to human society while protecting the masquerade that kept their kind hidden. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant vigilance and adjustment, but it allowed them to live with integrity and purpose. Elena never forgot her human life, though the memories grew more distant with each passing year. She remembered her family, who had long since died believing she had perished in some distant land. She remembered her professors and colleagues, who had perhaps wondered what had become of the promising young scholar who had simply disappeared. She remembered the person she had been before transformation, and she honored that person by maintaining the intellectual curiosity and ethical commitments that had defined her human existence. As Elena's first century as a vampire approached its end, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had transformed from mortal to immortal, from human scholar to vampire observer, from someone who studied folklore to someone who embodied it. She had gained knowledge and experience beyond anything her human self could have imagined, but she had also paid prices her human self could never have anticipated. Yet when she looked at Viktor, when she felt the deep connection they shared, when she considered the vast expanse of time still ahead of them, she knew she had made the right choice. Immortality was difficult and often painful, but it was also rich with possibility. She had centuries still ahead of her to learn and grow, to pursue understanding and create meaning. And perhaps most importantly, she had company on the journey. Viktor was not just her partner, but her fellow traveler through eternity. Someone who shared her burdens and celebrated her joys, who understood her in ways no one else could because he walked the same dark path. As they stood together on the Charles Bridge one night, exactly 100 years after Elena's transformation, watching the river flow beneath them as it had for centuries, Elena felt a profound sense of peace. The Baroque statues looked down on them with their eternal expressions, and the city of Prague spread out around them in all its medieval beauty. Elena took Viktor's hand and felt the cool certainty of his presence. She thought about all they had experienced together, all they had yet to discover, all the years and centuries that stretched before them like an endless road through darkness. She had crossed from mortal life to immortal existence, from the world of ordinary human experience to the shadowy realm of the supernatural. She had paid the price of